Why many conservatives believe the left hates America. A recurring theme in U.S. politics is the conservative claim that the political left hates America. This belief reflects deep polarization and conflicting ideas about patriotism, history, and core values. Understanding why many conservatives hold this view requires exploring its historical roots, the role of right-wing media and leaders in amplifying the narrative, the specific arguments used to justify it, and the contrasting ways the right and left define concepts like freedom and individual rights. In this essay is an analysis of these factors with historical context and ideological differences to shed light on this perception. Historical roots of the perception. Many conservatives' conviction that the left hates America has developed over decades, shaped by key cultural and political moments. Early Cold War, the 1950s Red Scare. During the McCarthy era, anti-communist fervor led conservatives to conflate left-wing politics with disloyalty. Figures on the right accused liberals and leftists of being communist sympathizers, or un-American, planting an early idea that the left was hostile to American values. Senator McCarthy's hearings and rhetoric painted many New Deal liberals as traitors, cementing suspicion that those on the left didn't truly love their country. 1960s, Vietnam War and counterculture. The tumult of the 1960s intensified these perceptions. Left-aligned anti-war protesters burned flags and denounced U.S. policies in Vietnam, actions conservatives saw as unpatriotic. The popular conservative slogan, "America, love it or leave it," emerged in this era, implying that war protesters and civil rights radicals hated America if they couldn't support it unconditionally. The cultural counterculture, such as hippies and student activists, often challenged American institutions and symbols, which to many on the right was evidence that the left held America in contempt. This era's clashes gave rise to the idea that critiquing America, especially during war, was equivalent to hating it. 1970s post-Vietnam cynicism. In the 1970s, the aftermath of Vietnam and Watergate saw widespread distrust in government across the spectrum. Mainstream liberals criticized U.S. institutions such as the CIA and highlighted social injustices. Conservatives often interpreted these critiques as lack of patriotism. The phrase "blame America first" started to percolate, describing those who seemingly pointed to America as the source of global problems. This sentiment set the stage for a defining moment in the 1980s. The 1980s Blame America First charge. The perception was explicitly articulated on the national stage during Ronald Reagan's presidency. In a famous 1984 speech at the Republican National Convention, former Democrat-turned-Reagan ally Janine Kirkpatrick accused the Democratic Party's left wing of a constant anti-American bias. She blasted the Blame America First crowd, saying they habitually always blame America first whenever something went wrong in the world. For example, Kirkpatrick noted that when communist aggression occurred or U.S. Marines were attacked, these liberals didn't blame Cuba or the communists, they blamed the United States instead. Somehow, they always blame America first. Her speech resonated with conservatives and popularized the notion that the left reflexively finds fault with America rather than its enemies. This era also saw President Reagan emphasize pride in America and its freedom, implicitly contrasting his patriotism with what he and his supporters viewed as the left's pessimism about America. The 1990s culture wars and patriotism debates. The end of the Cold War and domestic culture wars kept the narrative alive. In the 90s, some conservatives felt that political correctness on college campuses and multicultural critiques of U.S. history were attempts by the left to undermine pride in American heritage. Fights over issues like school prayer, flag burning, which the Supreme Court protected as free speech in 1989, and revising school curricula to include America's flaws led conservatives to argue that liberals were indoctrinating shame rather than patriotism. For instance, Republican leaders like Newt Gingrich encouraged painting opponents as un-American in rhetoric. Though not as stark as in the 80s, the notion that liberals had lost patriotism percolated. By 1999, commentators noted a growing split in how the two parties displayed love of country. Polling began to reflect this. Even then, Republicans were more likely to call themselves patriotic than Democrats, a gap that conservative pundits eagerly pointed to as proof of the left's disdain for America. Post-Y2K, 9/11 and the War on Terror. The terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001 and the subsequent War on Terror brought patriotism to the fore. Initially, Americans were largely unified, but as the Iraq War grew controversial, conservatives again accused war critics on the left of hating America or undermining the troops. In this charged climate, right-wing commentators doubled down on the theme. For example, in 2003, Ann Coulter published Treason, Liberal Treachery from the Cold War to the War on Terrorism, bluntly arguing that liberals had a long history of betraying the nation. She wrote that whether they are defending the Soviet Union or bleeding for Saddam Hussein, liberals are always against America. They are either traitors or idiots. Such fiery rhetoric became popular in conservative media. Even the renaming of French fries to freedom fries in the congressional cafeteria to spite France's opposition to the Iraq invasion illustrated a mentality that anyone not fully aligned with U.S. policy was suspect. The with us or against us attitude of the era cast suspicion on the left's loyalty, fueling the belief that liberals secretly loathed American power and values.
2010s, recent flashpoints.
In the past decade, multiple cultural flashpoints further convinced conservatives that the left hates America. Barack Obama's presidency was one. Some conservatives claimed Obama himself was not sufficiently patriotic. Notably, critics seized on his past association with Reverend Jeremiah Wright, who had delivered sermons condemning America's racial injustices. In 2008, conservative figures like Sarah Palin and talk radio hosts questioned whether Obama and his supporters love America, suggesting their goal was to fundamentally transform and thus implicitly disparage the country. Later controversies, such as NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick's 2016 decision to kneel during the national anthem to protest racial injustice, were taken by many on the right as proof that the left disrespects American symbols and therefore the nation itself. The left's critiques of Confederate monuments and even of some founding fathers' slaveholding were recast by conservatives as hatred of American history. In 2020, amid nationwide Black Lives Matter protests against police brutality, some fringe incidents of flag burning or vandalizing statues made headlines in right-wing media. President Donald Trump capitalized on these events to explicitly accuse the left of despising the country. In a 2020 speech at Mount Rushmore, he claimed an organized radical view of American history was being taught in which our children are taught in school to hate their own country and to believe that the men and women who built it were not heroes, but villains. Trump framed the removal of statues and the 1619 Project, which reframed U.S. history around slavery, as an attack on America's legacy. He argued that the extreme left-wing movement in culture defiles the memory of American heroes and seeks to purge history. Such statements from a sitting president were the culmination of decades of narrative. They reinforced to millions of his followers that the left's push for historical reckoning and social change is rooted in hatred for the country itself. In sum, historical episodes from the Cold War to the present have repeatedly been interpreted by conservatives as evidence that the left lacks patriotism. Protests against American actions, calls for social change, or critical examinations of U.S. history, all core to various left movements, have often been seen not as loyal dissent, but as hostility towards the nation. These flashpoints laid the groundwork for the left hates America trope to take hold. The role of right-wing media and politicians. Conservative media outlets, politicians, and thought leaders have played a central role in shaping and amplifying the narrative that the left hates America. Through talk radio, books, TV networks, and speeches, they have reinforced this belief amongst the conservative base. Talk radio and conservative authors. Beginning in the late 1980s, talk radio hosts like Rush Limbaugh routinely portrayed liberals as un-American. Limbaugh often characterized liberals as people who blame America first or root for American failure, cementing these ideas in the minds of his millions of listeners. Conservative authors have also explicitly pushed this theme. Ann Coulter's aforementioned Treason is one example. She flat-out labeled liberals as traitors. Another is Daniel J. Flynn's 2002 book, Why the Left Hates America, which argued that the left habitually denigrates America's greatness and achievements. In a campus lecture about his book, Flynn stated, "No matter how many good things America does for the world, the American left won't admit it," accusing leftists of overlooking U.S. contributions and unique freedoms. He argued the main problem with the left is that they compare America to a utopian ideal, so of course it falls short in their eyes. These kinds of books and speeches in conservative circles gave intellectual weight to the notion that the left is fundamentally anti-American. Fox News and television pundits. Since its launch in 1996, Fox News has been a powerful amplifier of the idea that the left hates America. Prominent Fox hosts regularly frame news and debates in terms that question liberals' patriotism. For instance, Fox primetime host Laura Ingraham ran a segment in 2024 titled "America's Left Hates All Things That Americans Support," explicitly claiming that the left opposes traditional American values. Ingraham and others have argued that liberals sneer at American patriotism and want to silence opposing viewpoints. Similarly, Sean Hannity often suggests that Democrats hate Trump's America and want to radically change or ruin it. Tucker Carlson frequently portrayed progressive social ideas as attacks on American culture and principles. Right-leaning opinion outlets beyond Fox, such as Breitbart, One American News, and various YouTube commentators echo these themes, ensuring that conservatives hear them constantly. Anytime a liberal activist says something critical of the U.S., these media amplify it as proof of the left's hatred for the country. The cumulative effect is a media ecosystem that normalizes the narrative that the left's agenda is fundamentally anti-American. Political leaders' rhetoric. Republican politicians have also reinforced this belief for political gain. During the Cold War, figures like Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan wrapped their policy arguments in patriotism, implying their liberal opponents were weak or apologetic about America. In the 21st century, this tendency became even more direct. Perhaps no one did it more bluntly than Donald Trump. Trump often claimed his opponents didn't love America. In 2019, he infamously suggested that 4 progressive congresswomen, often referred to as the Squad, all women of color, should go back to the places from which they came, accusing them of hating America, despite 3 of the 4 being U.S. born. In campaign rallies, Trump asserted that Democrats want to destroy American heritage and values. The Mount Rushmore speech quoted earlier is a prime example of him mainstreaming the idea that a radical left is waging a cultural war on the U.S. founding and teaching people to hate the country. Other GOP officials followed suit. For example, former Speaker Newt Gingrich often disparaged Democratic leaders as people who despise the classic America. Conservative firebrand Mark Levin took it a step further by authoring a 2023 bestseller literally titled "The Democratic Party Hates America." In promoting his book, Levin argued that Democratic left's agenda is fundamentally transforming and undermining American life. He even claimed that the Democratic Party was born to hate the country, tying today's liberals to a long history of alleged anti-American behavior. These statements from high-profile figures give the left hates America idea an official sheen. When supporters hear their trusted leaders and commentators repeating these lines, it validates their suspicion. Repetition and echo chambers. The narrative is reinforced by the echo chamber effect in conservative circles. Right-leaning media and politicians often cite each other. For instance, Fox News hosts might quote a Republican politician's attack on liberals' patriotism, which in turn was influenced by something a talk radio host said. Social media further amplifies selective examples that feed the narrative, such as a clip of left-wing protesters burning a flag or a college student saying the American flag represents oppression. These instances, even if rare, go viral in conservative networks as evidence that the left hates America. Over time, a steady diet of such stories convinces many conservatives that these are not isolated extremists but representative of the entire left. Polling reflects this polarization. In 2014, 36% of Republicans said Democratic policies were so misguided that they threaten the nation's well-being, and by extension, many believe that Democrats actively want to harm America. In a 2018 survey, 72% of Republicans described themselves as very patriotic versus only 29% of Democrats, a statistic some conservatives cite as proof that Democrats lack love of country. As a BYU political review noted, Republicans love statistics like this, anything to get another excuse to claim Democrats hate America. The conservative media sphere has created a feedback loop where the idea of the unpatriotic left is constantly validated and rarely challenged from within. Arguments used to justify the hates America claim. Conservatives who believe the left hates America often point to specific patterns of behavior or rhetoric from liberals as justification. These arguments usually fall into a few broad categories. Patriotism and national symbols. A common argument is that the left disrespects traditional expressions of patriotism such as the flag, the national anthem, and the Pledge of Allegiance, and therefore must hate the nation. Conservatives note that liberals are more likely to defend flag burning as free speech or to criticize nationalistic displays. High-profile incidents fuel this view. For example, when NFL players knelt during the national anthem to protest racial injustice, many on the right saw it as an insult to the flag and those who died for it. To conservatives, refusing to salute the flag or saying the flag represents oppression suggests hatred or at least lack of love for America. They contrast this with their own fervent patriotism. Conservatives often highlight surveys showing Republicans far more likely to call themselves extremely proud Americans than Democrats. The right tends to equate outward patriotic display with love of country, so the left's comparatively subdued or critical stance on those symbols is interpreted as antipathy. As one commentator put it, progressives' reluctance to celebrate unabashedly due to America's flaws is seen as proof that Democrats hate America. If one side is literally wrapping themselves in the flag and the other side is kneeling or critiquing, the flag wrappers' view is that critiques are un-American. Interpretation of U.S. history, historical revisionism. Another major argument is that the left focuses on America's sins rather than its greatness, betraying an attitude of contempt for the nation's founding ideals. Conservatives cite projects like the 1619 Project, which reframed American history around slavery's legacy as attempts to rewrite history in a negative light. They bristle at the removal of statues of figures like George Washington or Thomas Jefferson due to their slave ownership, a cause supported by some on the left, and claim it exemplifies hatred for America's heroes and origin. President Trump's assertion that the left's radical view of American history as a web of lies in which every hero is turned into a villain captures the sentiment. In the conservative view, liberals too often dwell on slavery, segregation, and past mistakes to the exclusion of the patriotic narratives about freedom and progress. They accuse left-wing academics and activists of teaching self-hatred, that is, making Americans feel ashamed of their country. The argument follows that if someone constantly emphasizes what is wrong with America, colonialism, racism, inequality, they must hate America itself. As evidence, they point to curricular changes that highlight oppression or to statements made by left-wing figures criticizing the Founding Fathers. Conservatives see themselves as defenders of American exceptionalism, the belief that the U.S. is an equally good force in the world, and view the left as rejecting that idea. Janine Kirkpatrick's 1984 dig at those who blame the United States policies of 100 years ago for contemporary problems abroad exemplifies the frustration. The left, in conservatives' eyes, won't stop berating America for past wrongs, rather than celebrating how far the nation has come. This focus on historical grievances is presented as evidence that liberals hate America's very story and essence. Criticism of U.S. institutions. Conservatives also argue that the left's critique of core American institutions indicate animosity towards the country. The U.S. military, for example, is one of the most respected institutions among conservatives. When anti-war protesters or leftist academics accuse the military of imperialism or war crimes, the right sees it as an attack on the nation's honor. The same could be said for law enforcement. Movements to reform or defund the police in response to racial bias are interpreted by many conservatives as an attack on the rule of law and those who keep America safe. During the 2020 Black Lives Matter protest, slogans like "all cops are bastards" or harsh condemnations of the police sparked outrage on the right. They argued that the left was painting all of America's police and even the justice system as evil, which in their view equates to hating America's domestic guardians and legal foundations. Similarly, if leftists protest against agencies like ICE or the Border Patrol's treatment of migrants, conservatives tend to frame it as the left hating American sovereignty. Even the left's criticism of capitalism and big corporations can be seen this way. Free enterprise is often considered a bedrock of American value on the right, so anti-capitalist rhetoric from the left, like democratic socialists calling for a revolution against the capitalistic system, is taken as hostility to the American way of life. In each case, conservatives conflate attacking institutional injustices with attacking America itself. They point to what they see as a pattern. Liberals only want to see the bad and want to tear down our institutions. Dan Flynn, for instance, argued that leftists will always find flaws. There's racism here, there's sexism here, because they measure America against perfection by highlighting every shortcoming. Not everyone has a job, environmental problem, as Dan Flynn sarcastically notes. The left is portrayed as willfully blind to everything good about the U.S. and intent on undermining the pillars that make it work. To conservatives, this is not constructive criticism, but a sign of ingratitude and hatred. They believe patriots fix problems quietly, but ultimately love their institutions, whereas the left wants to fundamentally dismantle those institutions out of disdain. Social justice movements and anti-American values. Social movements championed by the left, such as Black Lives Matter, LGBTQ+ rights campaigns, feminist and environmental movements, are sometimes framed by the right as attacks on American culture and values. For example, the Black Lives Matter movement has been portrayed by its detractors as Marxist, radical, anti-American. Many conservatives have insisted that BLM's leaders, who have in the past described themselves as trained Marxists, seek to tear down America and its institutions. The right seized on Black Lives Matter protests where American flags were burned or where protesters chanted against the police in evidence that the movement's true goal was to unleash chaos and destroy the American system. Similarly, LGBTQ+ rights movements have been attacked by some religious conservatives as undermining traditional American family values, and thus, in their view, undermining America. When the left pushes for transgender rights or marriage equality, Far-right conservatives at times claim this agenda is anti-American or anti-Christian, equating American identity with Christian heteronormative values. Wokeness in general, a term the right uses pejoratively for left-wing social justice activism, is described as a toxic, anti-American ideology. The left's embrace of secularism and globalism is also tossed into this mix. Social conservatives contend that liberals favor international institutions like the UN or climate accords over U.S. sovereignty, and promote cosmopolitan secular values over Judeo-Christian ones. This worldview labels such priorities as almost un-American, as if liberals care more about the globe or abstract ideals than about their own country, while liberals would argue that they simply see a need for reform in order to achieve America's promise. Conservatives often interpret the loud activism and demands for a change as a fundamental rejection of America as it is. The more radical the rhetoric, like activists shouting, "America was never great," or displaying the hammer and sickle on protest signs, the more it feeds the narrative that the left literally hates the nation. Conservative media highlights these extreme voices to paint the entire left with that brush. Thus, social justice movements, which often challenge the status quo, are perceived not as efforts to improve America, but as efforts to overthrow its core identity, confirming for believers that the left hates America. In each of these arguments, the pattern is that conservative critics take criticism or change as equivalent to hatred. The left, of course, would deny that patriotism requires blind approval. Many progressives argue that confronting shortcomings is an act of love. But from the right's perspective, the absence of unqualified praise, the constant calls for reform, and the willingness to challenge cherished symbols all signal an emotional disloyalty to the nation. To many conservatives, it appears that liberals only love America when it fits their ideal, and otherwise they blame America first for every problem, a perception solidified by decades of the narratives and events described previously. Competing definitions of freedom and individual rights. Underpinning this divide is a fundamental difference in how the left and right conceive of freedom and individual rights, which shapes their views on governance, policy, and what it means to love or hate America. Both sides invoke American freedom, but they interpret it in distinct ways. The conservative vision. Freedom as liberty from government, individualism. American conservatives typically emphasize negative liberty, freedom from external interference, especially from government. They see the United States as founded on the ideal of limited government that protects individual liberties, like property rights, free speech, and gun ownership, but otherwise stays out of citizens' lives. Any expansion of government control or redistribution was typically viewed with suspicion, as it could infringe on personal freedom. Ronald Reagan summarized this ethos in his 1989 farewell address: "Man is not free unless government is limited. As government expands, liberty contracts." This statement encapsulates how the right defines freedom. Taxes, regulations, and government programs are necessary evils at best and outright threats at worst. From this perspective, conservative patriots believe America's greatness lies in its guarantee of individual rights and free enterprise, the ability for each person to pursue happiness with undue restraint. Thus, they view many left-wing policies, like higher taxes on the wealthy, gun control, environmental regulations on businesses, and mandated health insurance, as attacks on freedom and, by extension, attacks on the American ideal. If liberals want to significantly increase government's role, conservatives fear America will no longer be the land of the free. Moreover, conservatives champion traditional rights enshrined in the Constitution: freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and the right to bear arms, often interpreting them in an absolutionist way. They accuse the left of undermining these rights, for instance, claiming that college campus speech codes or hate speech laws promoted by liberals violate free speech, or that gun control laws violate the Second Amendment. In the conservative frame, to love America is to love the liberty it guarantees. So those who seek to limit liberty, as conservatives believe many on the left do, are effectively acting against America's core values. This helps explain why conservatives conflate leftist policies with hating America. If you don't trust the people to make their own choices, instead imposing government control, you don't trust the very American principle of individual freedom. Culturally, this vision of freedom also ties into a preference for personal responsibility and self-reliance, traits conservatives consider quintessentially American. They often argue the left prefers collectivism over individualism, which they see as fundamentally un-American. In short, the right's definition of freedom is deeply tied to minimal governments and maximal personal liberty, and that worldview shapes their love of country. Any ideology that diverges from that, for example socialism, is seen not just as a policy disagreement, but as a rejection of American identity. Liberal left vision: freedom as opportunity and equity. The left, on the other hand, often emphasizes positive liberty, the capacity to fulfill one's potential, which sometimes requires proactive government measures. Many liberals argue that true freedom isn't just freedom from government tyranny, but also freedom to achieve a decent life. This view harks back to Franklin D. Roosevelt's Four Freedoms and his proposed Economic Bill of Rights. FDR famously said, a line often quoted by Bernie Sanders and other progressives, that true individual freedom cannot exist without economic security and independence. In practice, this means that the left believes that things like freedom from want, freedom from fear, access to healthcare, education, and a level economic playing field are necessary for individuals to be genuinely free. A person struggling in poverty or crushed by medical debt, they argue, doesn't have the real freedom to pursue happiness that a wealthier person does. Thus, liberals champion policies such as social safety nets, universal healthcare, anti-discrimination laws, and public education, not because they hate liberty or America, but because they want to extend the blessings of liberty to more people. They tend to view government not as the enemy of freedom, but as the guarantor of rights and an umpire that corrects injustices the free market or society may produce. When conservatives call America the freest nation on earth, liberals might counter that freedom is incomplete if large segments of society are disadvantaged or marginalized. For the left, equality and justice are intertwined with freedom. They prioritize individual rights in a social context. For example, the rights of minorities, women's rights such as reproductive freedom, LGBTQ+ rights, and workers' rights to fair wages. Often, securing these rights requires government action or legal protections, which the right views skeptically. Culturally, liberals are more communitarian. They see a role for collective action to improve society, and they celebrate dissent and reform as part of America's progress. A liberal might say that protesting wrongs is patriotic because it strives to form a more perfect union. This starkly contrasts with the conservative view that patriotism means loyalty and gratitude. The left is more willing to question authority and challenge established institutions in the name of social change. As the BYU Political Review noted, progressives try to reform existing institutions and are much more willing to challenge authority. Naturally, progressives are more reluctant to celebrate a society that they see as having serious problems, while conservatives would be quicker to celebrate and protect traditions they value. In liberal ideology, pointing out America's flaws and pushing for change isn't hate. It's seen as loving the country enough to want it to live up to its ideals. Freedom to the left includes the freedom to criticize and the freedom to demand redress of grievances. These differing philosophies of freedom and rights lead the two sides to very different views on governance and policy, which in turn feeds mutual suspicion. The right, valuing limited government and traditional liberties, sees left-wing policies of expansive government as undermining the very essence of America. Thus, they conclude, liberals must not love America as it is. The left, valuing equitable freedom and justice, sees conservative opposition to these policies as protecting privilege and inequality. Though they usually wouldn't say conservatives hate the disadvantaged, they do sometimes accuse the right of indifference to certain Americans' suffering. When it comes to cultural values, the conservative stress on individualism and nationalism clashes with the liberal stress on diversity and global cooperation. For example, conservatives often promote American exceptionalism and national pride in the flag, whereas liberals may emphasize that dissent is patriotic and that America must earn its greatness by how it treats all people. Each side thus interprets the other's concept of freedom through its own lens, often uncharitably. For a concrete example, consider freedom of speech. Both the left and the right say they support it, but a conservative might focus on freedom from censorship, such as opposing campus speech codes or defending a controversial speaker's right to speak, while a liberal might focus on freedom from oppression, supporting hate speech regulations to ensure marginalized groups feel safe to speak. Each accuses the other of being against free speech in some way. The conservative says the liberal wants to censor. The liberal says the conservative only cares about some voices. Similarly, with gun rights, conservatives see owning guns as a fundamental individual freedom and part of American tradition. Liberals emphasize the collective freedom to be safe from gun violence and thus advocate gun control. Both claim to uphold American liberty, but their priorities differ drastically. These differences shape governance. A conservative government cuts taxes and regulations in the name of liberty. A liberal government might raise taxes on the rich and provide health care in the name of equal opportunity. Each side's America feels different. One is minimal state, the other is welfare state. This informs what they view as patriotic. Crucially, the divergent definitions of freedom help explain the accusation of hating America. To conservatives, if liberals want to overhaul the system that they consider synonymous with American freedom, capitalism, small government, etc., then liberals must hate America's defining values. To liberals, if conservatives equate America only with a fixed set of traditions and won't acknowledge the need for change, they are neglecting the American promise. But liberals generally don't frame it as conservatives hate America. Rather, they say conservatives are stuck in the past or blind to injustice. It's far more common for the right to accuse the left of being anti-American, because of the right's tighter coupling of patriotism with preserving a certain concept of freedom and order. As a result, when a liberal burns the flag in protest, they might see it as exercising freedom of expression to critique the nation's failings, whereas a conservative sees the flag burning as literally burning the idea of America, an act one would only commit out of hate. Likewise, when liberals advocate policies like universal health care or stronger climate change action, they believe they are trying to help Americans and uphold the right to health care or the responsibility to future generations. But conservatives, suspicious of government power, perceive these moves as attacks on liberty and prosperity, essentially sabotaging what makes America great. Each side's worldview turns the other's patriotism inside out. In conclusion, the belief among many conservatives that the left hates America is rooted in a long history of ideological conflict and framing, from early Cold War anti-communism to the social upheavals of the 1960s, from the Blame America First charge of the Reagan years to the culture wars of today. Conservatives have often interpreted the left's criticism of U.S. policies and institutions as a lack of loyalty or love for the nation. Right-wing media and political leaders have vigorously reinforced this interpretation, repeating it until it became an article of faith in much of the conservative community. They highlight instances of left-wing dissent or radicalism as proof of an overarching anti-American attitude. Conservatives point to what they see as the left's aversion to patriotic symbols, its emphasis on America's flaws, and its challenges to traditional institutions and values as evidence that liberals hold America in contempt. Underlying all of this are competing conceptions of America's core principles: freedom, rights, and the meaning of patriotism. The right tends to equate patriotism with uncritical love, tradition, and individual liberty, while the left often equates it with aspiring to justice, reform, and collective betterment. These differences mean that the two sides sometimes literally do not recognize each other's form of patriotism as patriotism at all. To a conservative waving the flag, the sight of a protester torching the flag feels like hatred. To a liberal protester, dissent is an act of love to improve the country, whereas blind flag waving while ignoring wrongs seems like false patriotism. Sadly, in the rhetoric of partisan politics, nuance is lost. It's easier to score points by claiming your opponents don't just disagree, they hate our country. This rallying cry has galvanized the right for decades, creating a powerful narrative of us loyal Americans versus those ungrateful radicals. As shown, the reality is more complex. What conservatives often interpret as hatred may stem from a different kind of hope for what America could be. Nonetheless, the perception remains potent. Historical experiences, media reinforcement, and ideological chasms all combine to explain why many conservatives earnestly believe that the left doesn't just have different ideas, but actually hates America. Ultimately, understanding this dynamic is key to bridging the divide. Recognizing that each side defines love of country and the meaning of freedom differently could foster better dialogue. But as long as each measures the other against their own yardstick of patriotism, the accusation will continue to surface whenever partisan tensions run high. The narrative of the unpatriotic left has become entrenched in conservative identity, and it will likely persist unless a new unifying concept of American patriotism and freedom can emerge that both sides accept. For now, history, media, and ideology keep Americans split into camps that fundamentally question each other's love of country. That is the challenge that underlies not just a political talking point, but the very cohesion of the nation going forward. Thank you for listening. This has been Zach MG.
If you stuck around this far, I'd love to know your thoughts. Please leave a comment below and share this video.